I adopted two orphaned sisters who had lost absolutely every adult they ever trusted. My wealthy, image-obsessed parents adored the sweet 7-year-old, but my mother pointed a manicured finger at her teenage sister and told me to send the damaged one back. My eldest quietly packed her bags that night so her little sister could stay. I stopped her at the door, fiercely promising that we were a package deal. The next morning, a judge looked at the stack of documents I handed over, and the moment she read the first line of their secret group chat, my family's smug smiles completely vanished. Before I get into the details of this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that true family is about who chooses to stay when things get hard. My name is Hannah, and I am 32 years old. For my entire life, I was the outlier in a family that worshipped status, wealth, and pristine public images. While my parents and my sister chased corporate titles and country club memberships, I built a quiet, highly successful career as a children's book author and illustrator. They never took my career seriously. To them, I was just doodling. Keep the sweet one. Send the older girl back. She is just too damaged. My mother Beatrice delivered those words while casually cutting her filet mignon. She did not lower her voice. She did not even have the basic human decency to check if the children were within earshot. We were sitting in my dining room, a space I had spent weeks preparing for this supposedly welcoming family dinner. I stared at her, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth, entirely unable to process the casual cruelty of her statement. My newly adopted daughters, 13-year-old Riley and 7-year-old Lily, had been through unimaginable trauma. They had lost their biological parents in a horrific accident. They spent 2 years bouncing through a broken foster care system before I finally brought them home. Lily was naturally bubbly, eager to please, and quick to smile. Riley, forced to act as a mother to her younger sister for years, was guarded, fiercely protective, and understandably defensive. I looked around the table expecting anyone to challenge my mother. Instead, my father Thomas wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and nodded in complete agreement. "Your mother is right, Hannah," he said, using his coldest business tone. "You have to look at the return on investment here. The little one is young enough to be molded. She can still fit into this family. The teenager has too much baggage. She is going to drag you down, and frankly, she will end up ruining Lily's future as well." The coldness of his logic made me physically nauseous. I had invited them over to celebrate our first month together as an official family, hoping they would finally embrace the girls. Instead, they evaluated them like defective merchandise. My younger sister Caroline swirled the expensive red wine in her glass. She was the golden child, the one who married well, lived in a sprawling estate, and did everything according to our parents' strict blueprint. "Honestly, Hannah, you are in way over your head," Caroline chimed in, her voice dripping with fake concern. "You are single, you live in this modest house, and you are trying to handle a rebellious teenager who clearly hates authority. You should just focus on Lily. We could even help you with Lily. We could send her to the right private schools, get her into the right social circles. But Riley is a lost cause. She does not belong with us." I opened my mouth to defend my child, but Caroline's husband Jamal spoke up before I could utter a single word. Jamal was a highly paid corporate financial lawyer. He wore a bespoke suit to a casual family dinner just to ensure everyone knew exactly how much money he made. He leaned back in his chair, exuding a suffocating air of superiority. "Let us be brutally honest about the finances," Hannah, Jamal said, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "Raising one child is incredibly expensive. Raising a teenager with obvious psychological issues requires therapy, special programs, and resources you simply do not possess. You draw little cartoons for a living. You are a doodler. The income from your children's books cannot possibly sustain the kind of intensive intervention that older girl needs. You are being entirely selfish by keeping her. Give her back to the state before you bankrupt yourself." He had absolutely no idea that my books were international bestsellers. My family had always dismissed my career, so I never bothered to correct their assumptions about my income. I let them believe I was barely scraping by because it kept their greedy hands away from my finances. But hearing Jamal weaponize my supposed poverty against my ability to be a mother ignited a fire in my chest. I placed my hands flat on the dining table, preparing to throw them all out of my house. Before I could speak, a slight movement caught my eye. I turned my head toward the hallway leading to the living room. Riley was standing in the shadows. She was holding a plate of half-eaten cookies I had baked for them earlier. I do not know how long she had been standing there, but the look on her face told me she had heard every single word. She did not cry. She did not yell. Her face was completely blank, her eyes dead and empty, reflecting a soul-crushing resignation. It was the look of a child who had been rejected so many times that she had come to expect it as her only reality. My heart shattered into a million pieces. Riley, I breathed, pushing my chair back abruptly. She did not wait for me. She turned around silently and walked up the stairs, her footsteps completely soundless. I rounded on my family, my voice trembling with a rage I had never felt before. "Get out of my house," I commanded, pointing toward the front door. "Every single one of you, get out right now." My mother scoffed, rolling her eyes as she stood up. "You are always so dramatic, Hannah. We are just trying to protect you from making a massive mistake." I did not argue with her. I simply walked to the front door and held it open, refusing to say another word, until they gathered their coats and stepped out into the chilly night air. Jamal gave me one last pitying look as he walked past, muttering something about my inevitable failure. I slammed the heavy wooden door shut and firmly locked the deadbolt, wanting to physically block out their poisonous energy. The silence of the house felt incredibly heavy. I rushed upstairs, skipping steps in my desperation to reach Riley. Her bedroom door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and found the room empty. A sudden icy panic violently seized my throat. I ran down the hall to Lily's room. Lily was fast asleep in her bed, clutching her favorite stuffed bear, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding around her. But Riley was not there either. I frantically checked the bathrooms, the guest room, and the home office. Nothing. I ran back downstairs, my mind racing through terrifying scenarios. That was when I saw her. Riley was standing by the back door in the mudroom. She was wearing her worn-out sneakers and a heavy winter coat. Over her shoulders, she had slung a torn, faded backpack that bulged with the few possessions she owned. She was quietly reaching for the doorknob, moving with the practiced stealth of a kid who was used to sneaking away in the dark. "Riley, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly would startle her. She froze, her hand hovering over the lock. She slowly turned to face me. Her jaw was set in a hard, determined line, but I could see the slight tremor in her chin. "I am leaving," she said, her voice rough and heavily guarded. "It is better this way." I took a slow, careful step toward her. "Why would you say that? This is your home. You do not have to run away anymore." She shook her head fiercely. "You heard them," she said. "I heard what your mother said. I heard what that guy in the suit said. They are right. I am damaged. I am going to ruin things for Lily." Tears pricked my eyes. "Riley, they do not get to decide who belongs in this family. I decide that. And I chose you. Both of you. We are a package deal. We are a team. We do not need them." I hugged her tightly, never letting her walk out that door. Riley let the heavy backpack slide off her shoulder. It hit the floor with a loud thud. She wrapped her thin arms around my waist and finally let out a ragged breath. The tough exterior she built to survive the harsh foster system crumbled against my chest. I held her, rocking her back and forth, wiping away the tears she allowed herself to shed. I told her she was safe, she was wanted, and no one was going to take her from me. Once her breathing steadied, I guided her upstairs to her bedroom. I pulled the quilt over her shoulders and stayed by her side until her eyes closed in an exhausted sleep. I walked across the hall to check on Lily, still fast asleep and completely oblivious to the cruel words spoken downstairs. Looking at their peaceful faces, a fierce protective instinct solidified in my gut. My family had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I went downstairs to clean up the wreckage of the evening. The room smelled of cold meat and expensive red wine. Abandoned plates sat on the table, a perfect metaphor for how my family treated everything. They consumed what they wanted and left the mess. I began stacking plates, scraping my mother's leftovers into the trash. Reaching for a discarded napkin near Caroline's seat, my hand brushed something metallic. I pulled the cloth away and found Caroline's silver iPad resting there. In her rush to leave, my golden child sister had forgotten her prized possession. I picked it up, intending to leave it by the door for when she came crawling back. But as my fingers gripped the metal, the screen suddenly illuminated the dark room. A bright notification banner popped up on the lock screen. It was a message from Jamal in a group chat labeled Family Business. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The preview text was visible because Caroline never bothered to secure her devices with a passcode. She believed no one would dare touch her things. The message preview read, "The paperwork is done. The trust fund will be accessible once we get the younger one." I froze. The words trust fund and the younger one echoed in my mind. Riley and Lily's biological parents had been public school teachers who died in a car accident. The foster agency explicitly told me the girls had no assets, no surviving relatives, and nothing except the clothes on their backs. What trust fund was Jamal talking about? My hands trembled as I swiped upward on the screen. It unlocked, automatically opening to the iMessage application. The group chat included my mother Beatrice, my father Thomas, my sister Caroline, and Jamal. I scrolled up, my eyes scanning the blue and gray text bubbles. What I uncovered in those pages was a reality so horrifying, it made my blood run cold. The conversation dated back to shortly after I finalized the adoption paperwork. My father had run a background check on the girls out of supposed concern for my safety. Instead of criminal records, his private investigator had uncovered a massive, heavily guarded financial secret. The girls' deceased biological grandfather had been a highly successful real estate developer. He had established an irrevocable trust fund for his grandchildren locked away in an offshore account. The trust was worth over $6 million. The money was designed to be released to the girls' legal guardians for their care and education, managed by a trustee until they turned 25. My family did not care about Lily. They did not think she was sweet or moldable. They despised both girls. To them, Riley and Lily were nothing but lottery tickets. But Jamal had pointed out a major hurdle in their group chat. He explained that claiming custody of both girls would trigger a state audit, especially since Riley was old enough to vocalize her opinions to a judge. Riley was too smart, too perceptive. She would see right through their facade. I read a message from my mother Beatrice. It said, "The teenager is garbage anyway. We cannot have a delinquent ruining our image. We just need the 7-year-old. She is young enough to manipulate. If we get Hannah to send the older one back to the system, she will look emotionally unstable. Then we swoop in, report Hannah as a toxic guardian, and take custody of the little one." Caroline had replied with a smiling emoji. She typed, "Exactly. Once Jamal manages the trust, we can siphon the funds through his shell companies under the guise of property investments for the child. We can finally buy that yacht in Miami. We just need Hannah to break." I felt a physical wave of nausea wash over me. I leaned against the dining table, gasping for air. The people who raised me were actively plotting to destroy a teenage girl's life and exploit a 7-year-old child just to buy a luxury boat. They came to my house tonight intending to psychologically break Riley, hoping she would run away, giving them the ammunition they needed to declare me an unfit mother. I kept scrolling, my eyes burning with unshed tears. The level of meticulous, calculated evil in their messages was staggering. Jamal had laid out the entire legal strategy step by step. He planned to use his connections in the family court system to fast-track an emergency custody order. He had even drafted a fake psychological profile on me. He cited mild depression I experienced during college as proof that I was mentally fragile and incapable of handling motherhood. Thomas contributed to the plan by suggesting they stage a dangerous incident at my house, something that would trigger a visit from Child Protective Services. They wanted to build a mountain of fabricated evidence to ensure that when they made their move, I would not stand a chance in court. They viewed me as a minor obstacle standing between them and $6 million. I stared at the iPad, the light illuminating my face in the dark room. The years of feeling inadequate, of wondering why I was never enough, made perfect sense. They lacked the capacity for genuine human connection. They viewed every relationship as a transaction, every person as an asset to be leveraged or a liability to be discarded. And now they were trying to apply their ruthless corporate tactics to my children. I took a deep breath, forcing the panic down. I could not afford to fall apart. If I panicked, they would win. If I let them see, I was afraid they would use it against me. I needed to be colder and more strategic than they ever thought possible. I needed to protect my daughters at all costs. I quickly carried the iPad into my home office and connected it to my computer. I took screenshots of every message, timestamp, and damning admission in that group chat. I saved the files to my local drive, uploaded them to secure cloud servers, and emailed copies to a hidden address I used exclusively for book contracts. I was not going to let them destroy the only real family I had ever known. I disconnected the iPad and walked back into the dining room, placing it exactly where I found it, under the napkin. I wanted Caroline to think I had not seen a thing. I wanted them to remain arrogant and comfortable in their delusion of superiority. They believed I was just a naive, struggling artist who drew cartoons for a living. They had completely underestimated me. I spent years navigating cutthroat publishing contracts, negotiating licensing deals, and building a multi-million-dollar brand under their radar. I knew exactly how to play the long game. Just as I set the device down on the edge of the polished dining table, the screen lit up one more time. The sharp notification chime pierced the heavy, suffocating silence of the dark house. I leaned over and looked closely at the bright display. A new message from Jamal had just appeared in the family group chat. The text glared back at me, a final, chilling declaration of war. Court order filed. I will have the kid by tomorrow morning. Tell Hannah to enjoy her empty house. I stared at the brutal words as the screen slowly faded to black. The final countdown had officially started tonight. They were coming for Lily at dawn, armed with legal documents and fabricated lies. They thought they had backed me into an impossible corner. They thought I would crumble under the weight of their absolute authority over me. But they had made one massive, fatal miscalculation today. They assumed I would fight fair against them. I walked into the kitchen, picked up my phone, and dialed a number I saved for absolute emergencies. It was time to show my family exactly what happens when you threaten a mother and her children. She answered on the second ring. Her name was Veronica Pierce. I met her 2 years ago at a charity gala. Veronica was known as a ruthless family law attorney who ate arrogant corporate lawyers for breakfast. We spoke briefly about my adoption process back then, and she gave me her private card. I explained the situation in rapid, hushed tones, detailing the offshore trust fund, the fake psychological profile, and the fabricated emergency custody order. Veronica did not express pity. She simply asked if I had the financial resources to engage in a scorched earth legal battle. I confirmed my accounts held over $3 million in liquid assets. Her response was a sharp, predatory laugh. She told me to meet her at the courthouse at 8 in the morning and let Jamal dig his own grave. The sun had barely crept above the horizon when heavy pounding echoed through my front door. It was exactly 6 in the morning. I walked down the stairs, pulling my robe tighter around myself, and opened the door. A board process server handed me a thick manila envelope and walked away without a word. The emergency custody petition bore the official seal of the family court. Jamal had worked fast, leveraging his high-level connections to push the paperwork through a judge he likely played golf with. The petition demanded the immediate transfer of Lily to Caroline and Jamal, citing an unsafe environment created by my older daughter, Riley. It included a mandated psychological evaluation for me. I felt a surge of pure adrenaline. They were actually going through with it. I quietly woke Riley and Lily, packed them a bag of snacks, and drove them to the home of a trusted retired teacher who lived 3 streets over. I promised them I would definitely be back before lunch. The downtown courthouse was an imposing granite building that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. I walked through the metal detectors and took the heavy brass elevator to the third-floor family division. As the doors slid open, the first thing I saw was Jamal and Caroline standing by the clerk's desk. Jamal was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored navy suit that likely cost more than a reliable used car. He was leaning casually against the wooden counter, laughing with the court clerk as if they were old friends. Caroline stood beside him wearing a pristine white designer dress, playing the role of the concerned wealthy aunt to absolute perfection. When Caroline spotted me stepping out of the elevator, her fake smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer contempt. She tapped Jamal on the arm. He turned around, his eyes locking onto mine with the predatory gleam of a man who believed he had already won. Jamal adjusted his silk tie and walked down the hallway toward me. Caroline followed behind him, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. I forced my breathing to become shallow, letting my shoulders slump forward. I needed to look exactly like the terrified, financially struggling artist they believed I was. "Well," Hannah, Jamal said with mock sympathy, "I see you got the paperwork this morning. Let us make this easy for everyone involved. If you surrender Lily to us quietly, I will not pursue a permanent restraining order against you and the older delinquent. You can walk away and go back to drawing your little pictures." I widened my eyes, forcing my hands to tremble visibly as I clutched my cheap canvas tote bag. "You cannot do this," I stammered, making sure my voice cracked. "You have no grounds to take her. Riley is not a danger to anyone." Jamal let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, using his height to physically intimidate me. "I have every legal ground I need," he whispered coldly. "You see, I pulled your college medical records, Hannah. I have documented proof of your depressive episodes. I have sworn affidavits from your parents stating that your home environment is toxic and unstable. I have filed motions you cannot even comprehend, let alone fight. Do you have any idea how much a legal battle costs? It will bankrupt you in a week. Surrender the child, or I will destroy you in that courtroom and ensure you never see either of them again." Caroline crossed her arms, looking at me with absolute disgust. "Give it up, Hannah," she said harshly. "You were always a failure. You cannot afford to raise them, and you certainly cannot afford to fight Jamal. Do the right thing for once and let Lily live with people who can actually provide for her. Keep the damaged one. We do not want her anyway." I forced a single tear to fall down my cheek. I looked away, biting my lip as if I was desperately trying to hold myself together. "Please," I whispered, staring at the marble floor. "Please do not take my baby." Jamal smirked, exchanging a victorious look with my sister. He patted me condescendingly on the shoulder. "It is already done, Hannah," he said smoothly. "The judge will sign the temporary order in 5 minutes." The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open. A bailiff stepped out and called our names. Jamal confidently strode into the room, holding the door open for Caroline with exaggerated politeness. I followed them inside, keeping my head bowed, my hands still shaking for their benefit. The courtroom was vast and intimidating, filled with dark oak benches and an elevated bench for the judge. Jamal and Caroline took their seats at the petitioner's table. I walked over to the respondent's table and sat down alone. I placed my canvas tote bag on the table and stared at my hands. Jamal was pulling out files, organizing his fabricated evidence with complete arrogance. He believed he was facing an unrepresented, emotionally unstable woman with no financial resources. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge. We stood as a stern-looking woman in her late 50s took her seat at the bench. She adjusted her glasses and looked at the files in front of her. "This is an emergency petition for temporary custody filed by Jamal and Caroline," the judge stated, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. She looked at Jamal. "Counsel, you are representing yourself and your wife in this matter." Jamal stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Yes, Your Honor," he said smoothly. "We are filing for immediate emergency custody of our 7-year-old niece, Lily. The respondent, my sister-in-law, has created a highly toxic and dangerous environment by harboring an unstable, violent teenager in the home. Furthermore, we have medical documentation indicating the respondent suffers from severe depressive episodes, making her an unfit guardian. We are simply trying to protect an innocent child from imminent harm." The judge nodded slowly, making a note on her legal pad. She then turned her gaze toward my table. "Miss Hannah," she said, looking at me with a mixture of professional detachment and mild pity. "You appear to be unrepresented today. Do you understand the severity of the allegations filed against you in this emergency petition?" I stopped shaking. I lifted my head and looked directly at the judge. All the manufactured panic completely drained from my face. My posture straightened, and a cold, calm certainty settled over me. I turned my head slightly to look at Jamal and Caroline. Their smug smiles faltered for a fraction of a second as they noticed the sudden shift in my demeanor. I reached into my canvas tote bag, pushing aside the cheap notebooks I had placed on top for show. Underneath, I pulled out a thick, professionally bound stack of legal documents and placed it firmly on the heavy oak table. "Actually, Your Honor, I am fully represented today," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute confidence. "And before you rule on this fraudulent petition, my attorney has an emergency motion to submit regarding criminal intent to defraud a minor." Just as the words left my mouth, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sharp click of expensive heels echoed through the silent room. Jamal turned around, his confident expression instantly evaporating into unadulterated shock. Walking down the center aisle was Veronica Pierce, carrying a sleek leather briefcase and wearing a look that promised absolute destruction. She was the most feared, high-powered family law attorney in the state, a woman who charged thousands of dollars an hour, and she was walking straight to my table. She set her briefcase down, looked Jamal dead in the eye, and smiled. Jamal swallowed hard, all the color draining from his face as he realized his easy victory had just become his worst nightmare. He stood completely frozen, staring at the thick stack of papers on my table, finally understanding that he was now about to absolutely lose everything. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind Veronica Pierce as she took her place beside me at the respondents' table. She did not even spare Jamal a single glance. She simply unclasped her leather briefcase and pulled out a sleek silver pen. The judge peered over her glasses, her stern expression shifting into one of immediate recognition. "Counselor Pierce," the judge said, her tone instantly losing the patronizing edge she had used with me. "This is a surprise. I was not aware you were taking on emergency custody disputes this early on a Tuesday morning." Veronica offered a crisp and professional smile. "Neither was I, Your Honor. However, when my client presented me with undeniable evidence of a conspiracy to commit financial fraud against a minor, I felt compelled to make an exception." She picked up the thick stack of documents I had placed on the table and walked confidently toward the bench. "We are filing an emergency counter motion to dismiss this fraudulent custody petition with prejudice. Furthermore, we are submitting evidence that the petitioners are actively attempting to exploit the family court system to drain a hidden $6 million offshore trust fund belonging to my client's daughters." Jamal physically stumbled backward. His expensive leather shoes squeaked loudly against the polished marble floor. "Objection!" He practically shouted, his previously smooth baritone voice cracking with sheer panic. "Your Honor, this is an outrageous fabrication. My wife and I are here solely for the welfare of our niece. This woman is mentally unstable. These accusations are completely baseless." The judge held up her hand, silencing him instantly. "Sit down, counselor," she snapped. She accepted the thick binder from Veronica and opened it to the first tab. The courtroom dropped to a dead and suffocating silence. I watched Caroline clutch the edge of the petitioner's table, her perfectly manicured fingernails turning white. Her pristine white designer dress suddenly looked like a cheap costume. The air in the room grew heavy and cold. "I have before me certified and time-stamped transcripts of a group text message thread titled Family Business," the judge announced, her eyes scanning the first page. "These records were legally obtained from a device left unsecured on my client's property." The judge looked up, her gaze locking onto Jamal with the intensity of a predator eyeing its prey. "Would you care to explain this message sent from your personal phone number last Thursday at 9 in the evening? It reads, 'Once we force Hannah to abandon the older girl, the state will declare her unfit. We take custody of the 7-year-old, and I will use my firm shell accounts to legally siphon the trust. The new yacht will look phenomenal in Miami.'" A collective gasp echoed from the few clerks and bailiffs in the room. Jamal opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He tugged frantically at his silk tie, suddenly sweating profusely under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. His entire facade of corporate excellence completely dissolved into the terrified posture of a common criminal caught red-handed in the act. "Your Honor, those messages were taken out of context," Jamal stammered, gripping the wooden podium so hard his knuckles literally shook. "It was a private family joke. We have a dark sense of humor. That is all. It is absolutely not indicative of our true intentions regarding the child." The judge did not even blink. She slowly turned the page, the sound of the crisp paper slicing through the tense silence of the room. A joke, she repeated, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. Let us read another joke then. This one is from a contact listed as Beatrice. It says the teenager is orphan trash anyway. We cannot have a delinquent ruining our country club image. We just need the 7-year-old. She is young enough to manipulate. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not need to fake shaking anymore. I let the cold and hard reality of my family's cruelty wash over the courtroom. The judge read message after message, exposing every single dark and greedy corner of their twisted minds. She read Caroline's messages cheering about the yacht. She read my father's messages plotting to stage a dangerous incident at my house to trigger a state investigation. She laid out their entire blueprint for destroying my life and stealing the girl's inheritance. Your Honor, Jamal pleaded, his voice now a desperate and high-pitched whine. You cannot admit these logs into evidence. They violate digital privacy statutes. This is an inadmissible smear campaign orchestrated by a bitter and jealous sister who draws cartoons for a living. She cannot afford to care for those children. She is poor and unstable. Veronica Pierce stood up, slowly adjusting her suit jacket with an air of absolute authority. Actually, Your Honor, my client is a fiercely successful author whose book royalties place her in the top 1% of earners in this state. She is more than capable of providing for both of her daughters. The only people in this room driven by financial desperation are the petitioners who apparently need a stolen trust fund to finance their luxury lifestyle. The judge closed the binder with a loud and definitive thud. The sound echoed like a gunshot. She looked down at Jamal and Caroline with a level of contempt I had never seen on a judicial official before. Mr. Jamal. She began, her voice dangerously quiet and sharp. In my 20 years on the bench, I have seen parents fight over money. I have seen bitter custody disputes. But I have rarely witnessed such a calculated, predatory, and morally bankrupt scheme to exploit a grieving orphan for financial gain. You did not just attempt to commit fraud. You attempted to use my courtroom as the weapon to do it. Jamal stared at the floor, completely defeated. Caroline was silently crying, but not out of remorse. She was crying because her perfect and wealthy image had just been publicly shredded. She knew her dreams of Miami yachts and stolen millions were entirely dead. The emergency custody petition is denied with prejudice, the judge declared, picking up her heavy wooden gavel. Furthermore, I am issuing a permanent protective order. Neither you, your wife, nor your parents are permitted within 500 feet of Hannah or her daughters. Any attempt to contact them will result in your immediate arrest. The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she glared at Jamal. And as for you, counselor, I am officially forwarding this entire binder of evidence to the State Bar Association for an immediate review of your license. I am also submitting a referral to the Financial Crimes Division to initiate a formal fraud probe into your corporate accounts. We will see how much you enjoy your shell companies when federal investigators are tearing them apart. She slammed the gavel down. The sharp crack signaled the absolute end of my family's power over me. Petition denied. Court is adjourned. Jamal collapsed into his chair, putting his head in his hands. His bespoke suit suddenly looked like a prison uniform. Caroline buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with rage and humiliation. I stood up calmly, picked up my cheap canvas tote bag, and walked toward the exit. Veronica walked beside me, her heels clicking victoriously against the marble. We did not say a word to them as we passed their table. We did not need to. The victory spoke entirely for itself. We stepped out of the heavy wooden doors and into the bright and bustling hallway of the courthouse. The air felt lighter. I took a deep breath, feeling a massive weight lift off my chest. I had actually done it. I had protected my girls. I had beaten them at their own ruthless game. Thank you, Veronica, I said, turning to my attorney. I do not know how I could have faced them without you today. Veronica smiled, a genuine expression of respect. You did the hard part, Hannah. You gathered the evidence and kept your cool. They underestimated you, and it cost them everything. I will handle the protective order filings this afternoon. Go home and hug your girls tightly. I nodded, feeling a genuine smile spread across my face for the first time in days. I turned to walk toward the elevators, ready to pick up Riley and Lily and go home to celebrate our newly secured freedom. But before I could take 5 steps, the courtroom doors burst open behind me. Caroline stormed out into the hallway. Her pristine white dress was wrinkled. Her makeup was smeared down her cheeks and her eyes burned with an unhinged and venomous fury. She marched directly toward me, ignoring the warning shouts from the bailiff by the door. She stopped just inches from my face, her chest heaving with rage. "You think you won?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with pure malice. "You think you can just embarrass us in front of a judge and walk away with our money?" I stood my ground, staring her down with absolute calm. "It is not your money, Caroline. It belongs to Riley and Lily. And yes, I did win. Stay away from my family forever." Caroline let out a sharp and breathless laugh that sounded entirely psychotic. She leaned in closer, her breath hot against my ear. "You stupid and naive artist," she whispered. "Jamal and I knew the text messages might be a risk if you ever found out. We always have a backup plan. Did you really think we would leave this to chance?" I frowned, a sudden chill creeping up my spine. "What are you talking about right now?" Caroline took a step back, a triumphant and wicked smile twisting her tear-stained face. "I just called Child Protective Services," she announced, her voice echoing down the marble hallway. "We submitted an anonymous tip an hour before this hearing started, complete with photographic evidence of severe child abuse. They are kicking down your door right now. Enjoy your empty house, Hannah." My heart slammed against my ribs with the force of a freight train. Caroline stood there in the courthouse hallway, her smile dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. I did not waste a single second engaging with her twisted sense of victory. I spun around and sprinted down the marble corridor, my cheap canvas tote bag banging aggressively against my hip. Veronica shouted my name, warning me to wait for her to draft an emergency injunction, but I could not hear anything over the roaring panic in my ears. I burst through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse and ran toward my car. My hands shook violently as I fumbled with my keys, scraping the metal against the lock before finally yanking the door open. I threw the car into drive and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. My tires screeched against the asphalt as I pulled out of the parking structure. I grabbed my cell phone and dialed the number of the retired teacher who was watching my girls. The line rang 3 times before she answered, her voice calm and completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding. I told her I was on my way and to have the girls ready by the front door. I broke every speed limit in the city, weaving through morning traffic with reckless desperation. Jamal had meticulously planned this secondary attack. If he failed to win custody in front of a judge, he would use the state welfare system to rip the children from my arms by force. He knew the bureaucratic machinery of the state operated on immediate suspicion, acting first and asking questions later. I arrived at the retired teacher's house in record time. Riley and Lily were sitting on the front porch. Lily was happily swinging her legs, holding her favorite stuffed bear, while Riley stood next to her with her arms crossed, sensing my anxiety the moment my car jerked to a halt at the curb. "Get in the car," I ordered, trying desperately to keep my voice steady. Riley did not ask any questions. She grabbed her little sister's hand and ushered her into the back seat. I thanked the teacher quickly and sped back toward our neighborhood. I needed to get them inside our house, lock the doors, and wait for Veronica to arrive with the legal shield we desperately needed. As I turned the corner onto my quiet, tree-lined street, my stomach dropped straight into an endless void. 3 police cruisers with their lights flashing silently were parked erratically across my front lawn. 2 unmarked black sedans blocked the entrance to my driveway. Uniformed officers and personnel wearing state badges were swarming my property. Neighbors were standing on their porches, whispering and pointing as I slowly pulled my car to a halt behind the police blockade. "Mom, what is going on?" Lily asked from the back seat, her small voice trembling with sudden fear. Riley instantly moved closer to her sister, her protective instincts activating. "Stay behind me," Riley whispered, her eyes fixed on the approaching officers. Before I could even put the car in park, 2 uniformed police officers flanked my vehicle. A tall woman in a crisp gray suit walked purposefully toward my window. She held a thick clipboard against her chest. I rolled down the window, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. "Are you?" Hannah, the woman asked, her tone entirely devoid of warmth. "I am Agent Miller with Child Protective Services." We received a highly credible priority 1 emergency tip this morning regarding the immediate safety and welfare of the 2 minors in your vehicle. Please step out of the car. I tried to keep my voice respectful and calm, knowing that any display of anger would immediately be weaponized against me. Agent Miller, this is a malicious and fabricated report filed by my estranged brother-in-law. We literally just left family court, where a judge denied his fraudulent custody petition and recommended him for a financial crimes investigation. My attorney is on her way here right now. Agent Miller did not even blink. She signaled to the officers. I appreciate that you have a legal dispute, Hannah, but my sole jurisdiction is child safety. Based on the photographic evidence submitted to our office, I have authorization to temporarily remove the children from your custody, pending a full environmental assessment. Officers, please secure the minors. No, I screamed, my carefully maintained composure shattering instantly. You cannot take them. They have not done anything wrong. I reached back to unbuckle Lily, but an officer firmly grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the vehicle. Another officer opened the back door. Lily started crying hysterically, clutching her stuffed bear to her chest. Riley glared at the officers, refusing to move, wrapping her arms protectively around her little sister. Do not touch her, Riley warned, her voice hardened with a terrifying maturity. We will walk ourselves. Riley grabbed Lily's hand and stepped out of the car, glaring daggers at the CPS workers. Agent Miller instructed her team to take the girls inside the house to conduct separate, isolated interviews while the police secured the perimeter. They marched my daughters up the front steps and into my home like criminals. Agent Miller ordered me into the living room, instructing an officer to stand guard by the front door. The house I had spent months turning into a safe sanctuary for those girls was now a hostile interrogation zone. I sat on my sofa, my heart hammering against my ribs, while Agent Miller pulled a stack of printed photographs from her clipboard and threw them onto the coffee table. You claim this is a malicious report, Agent Miller said coldly, pointing at the images. Then perhaps you can explain these. I leaned forward and looked at the photos. My breath caught in my throat. They were pictures of my kitchen, but it was completely trashed. Garbage overflowed onto the floor. The refrigerator was wide open and completely empty, except for a few bottles of cheap alcohol. Another photo showed what looked like my hallway, but the drywall was smashed in and broken glass littered the carpet. The most horrifying picture was a close-up of a child's arm covered in dark purple bruises. The child was wearing the exact same pink sweater Lily had worn 2 days ago. These are fake, I gasped, recoiling from the images. These are heavily doctored. My house does not look like this. You can walk into my kitchen right now and see that it is perfectly clean. My brother-in-law is a wealthy corporate lawyer with endless resources. He had these photos digitally manipulated to look like my home. He is trying to steal their inheritance. Agent Miller crossed her arms, looking at me with severe skepticism. The anonymous tipster provided a very detailed account of your ongoing mental instability, citing a history of severe depression. The tipster stated that you have frequent violent outbursts and actively starve the younger child to punish her. These photographs were vetted by our intake department, and the metadata aligns with your residential location. We do not take emergency removals lightly, Hannah. I felt the walls of the living room closing in on me. Jamal had engineered a masterpiece of legal and digital manipulation. He had stripped the metadata from actual photos of my house and merged it with images of squalor and abuse. He knew that the family court judge would take hours to process the protective order and fraud probe. He used that exact window of time to blind the child welfare authorities, creating a smokescreen of fabricated abuse that forced them to act immediately. Agent Miller pulled a formal document from her clipboard and handed me a pen. I am executing an emergency 72-hour removal order, she stated, tapping the signature line. The girls will be placed in a temporary state facility while we conduct a comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation. If you refuse to sign this acknowledgement, the police will place you under arrest for obstruction, and the children will be removed regardless. I stared at the paper, my vision blurring with hot, terrified tears. I was moments away from losing my daughters to the very system that had already broken them once. The foster care system would swallow them whole, separating them into different group homes, destroying all the trust and safety we had built. Jamal had won. He had found the one vulnerability I could not protect against. I slowly reached for the pen, my fingers trembling uncontrollably. I felt entirely defeated. The heavy silence in the living room was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my own erratic breathing. I touched the tip of the pen to the paper, preparing to sign away my family to buy myself time to fight in court tomorrow. Just as the ink began to bleed into the crisp white paper, heavy footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor of the staircase. Agent Miller turned around sharply, annoyed by the interruption. I looked up through my tears. 13-year-old Riley was walking down the stairs. She was completely calm, her posture perfectly straight, and her expression entirely devoid of fear. A CPS worker was hurrying down the steps behind her, looking flustered and confused, holding a notepad filled with unanswered questions. Riley did not look like a frightened foster kid being ripped from her home. She looked like a commanding force of nature. She bypassed the police officer standing in the hallway and marched directly into the living room, stepping between me and the coffee table. She glared at Agent Miller with an intensity that made the seasoned investigator actually take a step back. Riley reached into the pocket of her denim jacket. She did not hesitate, and she did not break eye contact with the state officials trying to destroy our lives. "You need to stop talking to my mother right now," Riley demanded, her voice ringing out with absolute and unwavering authority. She pulled her hand out of her pocket and held it up for the entire room to see. "If you want to know who is actually abusing us, you need to look at what I have in my hand." Riley stood in the center of the living room, her posture radiating an intense protective energy that made her look much older than 13. The police officer stationed by the front door shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to handle a teenager who commanded the room with such absolute certainty. Agent Miller narrowed her eyes, her clipboard resting against her hip as she stared at my daughter. Lily remained tucked safely behind her older sister, clutching the edge of Riley's denim jacket. "What exactly do you have in your hand, Riley?" Agent Miller asked, her tone laced with professional skepticism. Riley did not flinch. She reached into the front pocket of her jacket and pulled out a small metallic object. It was not a weapon. It was a digital micro-recorder, the kind used by college students to record lectures. I recognized it immediately. I had bought it for her weeks ago to help her with her middle school science project. Riley pressed her thumb against the playback button, her eyes locking onto the state investigator. "You walked into our house and accused my mother of starving us," Riley stated, her voice remarkably steady. "You showed her pictures of a trashed kitchen and bruised arms. But those pictures are entirely fake. I know how the system works. I spent years bouncing around foster homes where people lied to my face every single day. The moment that rich lawyer and his wife started looking at me like I was a problem to be solved, I knew I needed insurance. So I started hiding this recorder inside Lily's stuffed bear every time we left the house." Agent Miller frowned, exchanging a quick, uncertain glance with the police officer. "What exactly did you record, Riley?" she asked, stepping closer to the coffee table. "The truth," Riley replied coldly. She held the small device up and pressed the play button. A sharp crackle of static filled the tense silence of my living room, followed by the undeniable sound of my front door unlocking. I held my breath. I recognized the heavy, arrogant footsteps echoing through the small speaker. Then a voice cut through the audio. It was my mother, Beatrice. "Hurry up, Thomas. The doodler took the girls to their pediatrician appointment. We only have about an hour before they get back." Beatrice's voice sounded distorted but undeniably clear. My father Thomas grunted in response. "I am moving as fast as I can, Beatrice. Just find the teenager's room. Jamal said we need something that makes her look unstable. Look for a diary, some dark drawings, anything we can twist to fit the narrative." Agent Miller dropped her pen. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. She stared at the recorder in absolute shock. I felt a surge of terrifying realization. My own parents had broken into my house while I was taking the girls to a routine medical checkup. They had used the spare key I foolishly gave them for emergencies when I first adopted the girls. The audio continued to play. The sound of drawers being pulled open and items being tossed onto the floor echoed through the speaker. Then Beatrice let out an annoyed sigh. "This girl has absolutely nothing," Beatrice complained on the recording. No drugs, no weapon, nothing. She is just incredibly boring. Then we will have to handle her directly, Thomas replied, his voice dripping with malice. When Jamal files the custody paperwork for the little one, we will come back here. If that damaged teenager refuses to run away like she is supposed to, I will personally drag her to a psychiatric ward. I have enough money to pay off any doctor in this city to sign a commitment order. We will lock her up so tightly she will never see the light of day. She is just orphan trash standing between us and $6 million. We will do whatever it takes to get rid of her. A heavy, sickening silence fell over the living room as the recording clicked off. Riley lowered the device, her chin held high, defying anyone in the room to question the validity of what they had just heard. That was my grandfather and grandmother, Riley told Agent Miller, her voice cutting through the thick tension. They broke into our home. They searched my belongings. They threatened to have me locked in a mental hospital simply because I exist. My mother did not abuse us. My mother protected us from them. That lawyer you are taking orders from manipulated you. He wants to steal our inheritance. Agent Miller stood completely frozen, the color rapidly draining from her face. She looked at the doctored photographs sitting on my coffee table, then looked at the fierce, brave teenager standing in front of me. The seasoned investigator realized instantly that she had been used as a pawn in a massive predatory financial conspiracy. The entire premise of her emergency removal order had just been blown to pieces by a 13-year-old girl. Agent Miller turned to the police officer by the door. "Officer," she said, her voice shaking slightly with suppressed outrage. "Call dispatch immediately. I need a direct line to the district attorney. We have a severe escalation here." The officer nodded and quickly pulled his radio from his belt, stepping out onto the front porch to make the call. Agent Miller turned back to me, her demeanor completely transformed. The cold, detached investigator was gone. In her place was a woman who realized she had almost handed two vulnerable children over to monsters. Hannah, Agent Miller began, her voice softening as she picked up the doctored photographs from the table. "I need to formally apologize to you. These images were submitted through a secure portal using a verified legal identification number. Given the nature of the allegations and the credentials of the person who submitted them, we had no choice but to act. But this recording changes everything. This is a coordinated case of criminal child endangerment, trespassing, and filing a false report to a state agency." I pulled Riley into my arms, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You saved us," I whispered into her hair. "You are the bravest person I know." Lily wrapped her arms around my legs, burying her face against my jeans. We were safe. The nightmare of the foster system was not going to claim them again. Agent Miller pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. "The temporary removal order is officially voided," she announced, ripping the document she had asked me to sign right in half. "Your daughters are staying right here with you. However, I need to take that recording into evidence. We are pivoting this entire investigation. Your parents and your brother-in-law are going to be facing immediate criminal charges. They used the Department of Child Services to facilitate a financial crime. The state does not take that lightly." The police officer stepped back inside the house, his expression serious. "Agent Miller," he said, "Dispatch just confirmed the arrest warrants for Thomas and Beatrice are being drafted. Officers are heading to their estate right now to bring them in for questioning regarding the break-in and the threats against the minor." I felt a massive wave of relief wash over my entire body. My parents were finally going to face the consequences of their ruthless greed. They thought their wealth and status made them untouchable. They thought they could crush a teenage girl and manipulate the legal system without breaking a sweat. But they had vastly underestimated the loyalty of my family. As Agent Miller began packing up her files, placing the doctored photographs into an evidence bag, my cell phone vibrated violently in my back pocket. I reached for it, expecting a text from Veronica regarding the protective order we had filed earlier that morning at the courthouse. Instead, an unknown local number flashed across the bright screen. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before hitting the green accept button and lifting the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice cautious and low. "Is this Hannah?" a sharp, fast-paced female voice asked on the other end of the line. "This is the breaking news desk at the City Chronicle. We are calling regarding a massive leak of sealed family court transcripts we received anonymously 10 minutes ago." My pulse skyrocketed. The City Chronicle was the largest and most influential media outlet in the state. If they had the transcripts, that meant the entire city was about to know the truth. I am listening, I replied, my eyes darting toward Riley and Lily, who were now sitting safely on the sofa. The reporter continued, her voice vibrating with journalistic excitement. We have verified documents detailing an emergency hearing from this morning. The transcripts indicate that Jamal, a prominent corporate financial attorney, explicitly plotted to siphon a $6 million trust fund belonging to two orphaned minors. The documents also implicate his wife Caroline and his in-laws in a coordinated scheme to defraud the court. We are running this story on the front page of our evening edition, and we are planning to broadcast the details on our 6 o'clock news broadcast tonight. Do you have any comment regarding your family's involvement in this multi-million-dollar fraud ring? I stood perfectly still in the center of my living room. Jamal had built his entire career on his pristine, untouchable public image. He wore expensive suits, drove luxury cars, and looked down on everyone he considered beneath him. He had mocked my career, called me a doodler, and tried to steal my children to finance his lavish lifestyle. Now his entire reputation was about to be burned to the ground in front of millions of people. I looked at the CPS agent, who was currently coordinating the arrest of my parents. I looked at my brave, resilient daughters, who had fought so hard to stay with me. The empire of lies my family had built was completely fracturing from within. They were about to lose everything they valued most. I smiled, a cold, calculated expression spreading across my face. Yes, I told the reporter, my voice completely steady. I have a comment. Tell your viewers that the truth always comes to light, and tell Jamal his time is officially up. I hung up the phone and watched the local news broadcast that evening, with Riley and Lily sitting safely beside me. The television screen flashed with bold red banners. Breaking news. Prominent corporate attorney implicated in minor trust fund fraud. The reporter detailed every single piece of evidence we had submitted to the court that morning. They displayed blurred images of the text messages highlighting the specific quotes about buying a yacht with stolen inheritance money. Jamal had spent his entire adult life cultivating an image of absolute perfection. He was a highly successful African-American lawyer who prided himself on breaking barriers and securing elite clientele. Now his face was plastered across every television screen in the city under the banner of a financial predator. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. By noon the next day, my phone was flooded with updates from Veronica. The State Bar Association had officially suspended Jamal, pending a full ethics investigation. His law firm, desperate to protect their own pristine reputation, placed him on indefinite unpaid leave. The media leak acted like a lit match dropped into a powder keg. My family's toxic unity, built entirely on a foundation of greed and mutual superiority, shattered instantly when self-preservation kicked in. They were no longer a united front against me. They were cornered animals, and cornered animals always turn on each other to survive. I knew exactly how Jamal operated. He was a creature of habit who sought comfort in displays of wealth whenever he felt threatened. I also knew he had a standing reservation every Thursday evening at an exclusive downtown steakhouse, a place where he typically entertained high-paying clients. He would not cancel it. He would go there to drink expensive scotch and figure out how to salvage his ruined career. I dressed in a sharp, tailored black suit that radiated quiet authority and drove downtown. The restaurant was dimly lit, smelling of rich mahogany and aged leather. I spotted Jamal sitting alone in a curved velvet booth near the back. His usual arrogance was completely gone. His bespoke suit looked rumpled, his tie was loosened, and he was staring into a glass of amber liquid with a look of absolute defeat. I walked across the dining room, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. I slid into the booth directly across from him. He jumped slightly, his eyes widening in shock as he registered my presence. "Hello, Jamal," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You look like a man who could use a genuine friend today." He stared at me, his jaw tightening. He looked around the restaurant nervously, as if expecting the police to arrest him right then and there. "What are you doing here, Hannah?" he hissed, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "There is a permanent protective order. You cannot be within 500 feet of me. I will call the police. I smiled a cold and calculated expression. I am the protected party, Jamal. I can sit wherever I please. But if you would like to call the police and draw even more attention to yourself, be my guest. I am sure the reporters waiting outside your office would absolutely love to get a statement from you in handcuffs right now. He swallowed hard, his hand trembling as he reached for his drink. He took a long sip, the liquid burning his throat. He looked at me, the arrogant corporate shark completely replaced by a desperate, terrified man. The media leak destroyed me, he admitted, his voice cracking. My firm locked me out of the building. The Bar Association is preparing to revoke my license permanently. I am facing federal fraud charges. Actions have consequences, I replied smoothly. You tried to rip two traumatized children away from the only mother who ever loved them all so you could buy a luxury boat. You deserve every single thing that is happening to you. He leaned forward across the heavy wooden table. The smell of expensive alcohol wafted off him. I was wrong, he pleaded, dropping every ounce of his pride. I miscalculated. I underestimated you. But Hannah, you have to listen to me. I was not the mastermind behind all of this. It was your parents. It was Caroline. They pushed me into it. They wanted the money just as badly as I did. They told me you were weak and would hand the girls over without a fight. I maintained my icy composure. I do not care who pushed who, Jamal. You filed the fraudulent paperwork. You submitted the doctored photographs. You are the legal professional who orchestrated the attack. And now you are going to pay the ultimate price for it. Hannah, please, he begged, his eyes wide with frantic desperation. I have spent my entire life building my career. I climbed my way up from nothing to become a partner at a top-tier firm. If you do not retract your complaint to the Bar Association, my life is completely over. I will do anything you ask. Tell me what you want. I will give it to you immediately. I let the silence stretch between us. I watched him squirm under my steady gaze. This was the exact moment I had orchestrated. I needed him desperate enough to hand over the final pieces of ammunition I required to dismantle my parents' empire entirely. I want my father, I stated plainly. Jamal blinked, confusion washing over his face. Thomas, he asked. Yes, Thomas, I confirmed. My father built a massive manufacturing company, and I know for a fact he has been cutting corners for decades. I know he hides assets. I know he manipulates his tax returns. But I need the physical proof. You are his son-in-law. You handle his offshore accounts. You know exactly where the bodies are buried. Give me the undeniable documented proof of his corporate tax evasion, and I will contact the Bar Association tomorrow to retract my personal complaint. Jamal stared at me, his mind racing as he weighed his options. He was being asked to betray his own father-in-law, the man who had funded his lavish lifestyle and welcomed him into their elite social circle. But Jamal was a survivor of all else. He had absolutely no loyalty to anyone but himself. If throwing my father under the bus meant saving his own law license, he would do it without a single second thought. If I give you the documents, he whispered, looking around the restaurant again, to ensure no one was listening. You have to promise me you will drop the ethics complaint. You have to tell them the text messages were a massive misunderstanding. I looked him dead in the eye. Bring me the documents and I will make the call. He reached down and picked up a sleek black leather briefcase resting on the seat beside him. He placed it on the table and popped the golden latches. He pulled out a thick sealed manila envelope and slid it across the polished wood toward me. Everything is in there, he said, his voice shaking slightly, as he handed over the evidence that would destroy his wife's family. Bank statements, hidden ledgers, offshore routing numbers. Thomas has been defrauding the federal government out of millions of dollars for over 10 years. The Internal Revenue Service will have a field day with those records. It is enough to put him in federal prison for a very long time. I placed my hand on top of the envelope. I could feel the weight of my father's impending downfall resting right beneath my fingertips. Jamal had just handed me the key to completely annihilating the toxic empire my parents had spent their entire lives building up. And Caroline, I asked, testing the absolute limit of his betrayal. What exactly does my sister know about all this? Caroline knows everything, Jamal admitted quickly, eager to shift the blame away from himself. She helped him set up the shell accounts. She is listed as a silent partner on 3 of the fraudulent companies. She is just as guilty as he is, Hannah. I am telling you, they are a family of absolute criminals. I just got caught in their crossfire. I almost laughed at his pathetic attempt to play the victim. He was perfectly happy to be part of their criminal enterprise when it benefited him. But the moment the ship started sinking, he was the first rat to jump overboard. I picked up the manila envelope and slid it into my tote bag. "Thank you, Jamal," I said, sliding out of the velvet booth. "You have been incredibly helpful to me today." He let out a massive sigh of relief, sagging against the leather seat. "So you will call the bar association tomorrow. You will retract the complaint and save my license." I stood over him, looking down at the broken, miserable man who had tried to steal my children. "I will make a call tomorrow, Jamal. That is an absolute promise." I turned and walked out of the upscale restaurant, leaving him sitting alone with his empty glass and his shattered career. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped out onto the bustling city street. I walked to my car parked a few blocks away and climbed into the driver's seat. I locked the doors and pulled the manila envelope from my bag, tracing my fingers over the smooth paper. Jamal thought he had just saved himself. I thought he had successfully negotiated his way out of total destruction. I was completely wrong about that. I reached into the front pocket of my blazer and pulled out my cell phone. I did not open my contacts to call the bar association. Instead, I opened my voice memo application. From the exact moment I sat down in that restaurant booth, my phone had been quietly recording every single word spoken between us. The audio file was crystal clear. It captured Jamal begging for mercy. It captured him handing over the financial documents. And most importantly, it captured him throwing his wife and his father-in-law to the wolves without a single ounce of hesitation. I clicked on the audio file and hit the share button. I typed in Caroline's phone number. My sister had spent her entire life believing she had the perfect marriage, the perfect husband, and the perfect. She had looked down on me, mocked my career, and plotted to ruin my entire life. Now she was going to hear exactly what her perfect husband really thought of her when his own skin was on the line. I pressed send. The small blue progress bar shot across the screen, confirming the audio file had been delivered directly to Caroline's phone. I placed my phone on the passenger seat and started the engine. The toxic foundation of my family had already cracked. Now they were going to tear each other completely apart. I pulled out of the parking space and merged into the evening traffic, feeling an overwhelming sense of calm. The hardest battles were over, and the final reckoning was finally beginning. The drive back to my house was quiet. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was entirely focused on the digital bomb I had just dropped into the lap of my golden child sister. Caroline was at my parents' sprawling estate. She had moved back into her childhood bedroom the moment the scandal broke, seeking the protective bubble of our mother's obsessive coddling. I knew her exact routine. At this hour, she would be sitting in the opulent living room, sipping imported wine and complaining about how my existence had ruined her perfect social standing. When her phone chimed with the audio file, I imagined she rolled her eyes, expecting another media inquiry or a message from a sympathetic country club friend. She pressed play. The pristine silence was instantly shattered by the groveling voice of her husband. She heard Jamal begging for his career. She heard him call her a criminal. She heard him eagerly volunteer every single detail of her involvement in the shell companies and the offshore trust fund scheme. She heard the man she married throw her directly under the bus to save his own miserable skin. I knew Caroline erupted into a hysterical rage. Her entire identity was tied to being a flawless, wealthy wife. Hearing him sell her out destroyed her fragile reality in a matter of seconds. She screamed so loudly that the sound likely echoed through the massive corridors of the estate. She threw her wineglass against the marble fireplace, sending shards of crystal flying across the expensive Persian rug. Beatrice rushed into the room, demanding to know what was happening. Caroline simply shoved the phone into my mother's hands and forced her to listen to the audio recording of her beloved son-in-law, handing their entire criminal enterprise over to me. Jamal drove straight to the estate, unaware his betrayal had beaten him there. He walked through the heavy front doors, expecting to find his wife and in-laws strategizing their next legal defense. Instead, he walked into an absolute slaughterhouse. Caroline launched herself at him the second he stepped into the grand foyer. She did not use words. She used her fists, tearing at his suit, scratching his face with her nails. Jamal stumbled backward, throwing his hands up to protect his face as his wife screamed that he was a pathetic, treacherous coward. Beatrice joined the fray, hurling insults and demanding to know how he could possibly betray the family that gave him everything. The elegant, sophisticated facade my family had spent decades building completely evaporated. They were reduced to a screaming, violent mess in the center of their pristine entryway. Jamal managed to shove Caroline away, his suit jacket torn and his face scratched. He did not bother trying to explain himself or apologize. He knew the audio recording was undeniable proof of his treachery. Self-preservation kicked in again. He turned his back on his hysterical wife and ran up the grand staircase toward their guest suite. He grabbed a leather bag and began frantically shoving his clothes and cash inside. He knew Caroline and Beatrice would be coming for his blood. Fleeing the state was his only viable option. He zipped the bag shut, threw it over his shoulder, and sprinted back out into the hallway. But his escape route was suddenly cut off. My father stood at the stairs blocking the path. Thomas had just finished a phone call that confirmed his absolute worst fears. The federal fraud probe I triggered by submitting the group chat transcripts had already reached the Internal Revenue Service. The authorities were moving with unprecedented speed. Thomas was informed his corporate accounts were frozen pending an audit. And now he was staring at the son-in-law, who had just handed over the explicit, documented proof of his decade-long tax evasion. Thomas did not yell. He radiated a cold, dangerous fury that was far more terrifying than Caroline's hysterical screaming. "Where exactly do you think you are going, Jamal?" My father asked, his voice low and threatening. Jamal gripped his duffel bag, his eyes darting around the hallway looking for another way out. "Get out of my way, Thomas. This family is completely done. I am leaving before the feds raid this entire property." "You are not going anywhere," Thomas growled, stepping closer and forcing Jamal back against the wall. "You arrogant fool. You handed Hannah the ledgers. You gave her the offshore routing numbers. You traded my entire manufacturing empire just to save your own pathetic law license, and you did not even succeed." Jamal tried to push past him, but Thomas shoved him hard in the chest. The heavy duffel bag slipped from Jamal's shoulder and tumbled down the grand staircase, bursting open at the bottom and spilling expensive watches and stacks of cash across the floor. Caroline and Beatrice stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the chaos unfolding above them. The pristine reputation of our family was being shredded to absolute pieces. Neighbors walking their dogs outside could likely hear the violent screaming echoing through the open windows of the estate. "You brought this on yourself," Jamal shouted back, finally losing his own temper. "You and your greedy wife wanted the trust fund. You pushed for the custody petition. I just provided the legal framework. I am not going to federal prison for your tax crimes, Thomas. I am leaving." The fight escalated from verbal threats to physical violence. My father grabbed Jamal by the collar of his torn shirt, slamming him against the expensive wallpaper. Caroline screamed from the bottom of the stairs, egging her father on, demanding that he make her husband pay for his betrayal. Beatrice frantically tried to close the front windows, terrified that the neighbors were witnessing their utter humiliation. The elite, untouchable family that had mocked my modest lifestyle and called my adopted daughters damaged was now physically brawling in their own hallway like common criminals. Jamal managed to break free from my father's grip. He scrambled down the stairs, ignoring his spilled belongings, and sprinted out the front door. He climbed into his luxury sedan, locked the doors, and sped away from the estate, leaving his furious wife and ruined in-laws standing in the wreckage of their own making. Thomas stood at the top of the staircase, his chest heaving as he stared down at the scattered cash and the broken pieces of his family. He walked slowly back into his home office and locked the heavy wooden door behind him. He collapsed into his leather desk chair, staring at the flashing notifications on his computer screen. His banks were rejecting his access credentials. His offshore accounts were completely locked down by federal authorities. His manufacturing business, the source of his entire identity and power, was about to be liquidated to pay off massive government fines. He had lost his money, his reputation, and his control over the narrative. But Thomas was a man who refused to go down quietly. If he was going to lose everything, he was going to make sure I went down with him. He convinced himself that I was the sole villain in this scenario. He rationalized that his tax evasion and his plot to steal a child's inheritance were minor indiscretions compared to my decision to expose them. He needed to regain control of the public narrative before the police arrived with federal arrest warrants. He picked up his cell phone and opened his contact list. Thomas had spent decades cultivating relationships with influential people in the city, including powerful media executives and local news producers. I knew exactly who to call to create a massive public spectacle. He dialed the direct number of a prominent television news director he frequently played golf with. The phone rang twice before the director answered. Thomas did not exchange pleasantries. He spoke with the desperate manufactured urgency of a man playing his absolute final card. "I need you to send your best camera crews to my estate tomorrow morning," Thomas demanded, his voice thick with fake emotion. "My family is the victim of a vicious extortion plot orchestrated by my own daughter. She has kidnapped my grandchildren, fabricated evidence to destroy my business, and manipulated the court system. I am holding a live press conference tomorrow at noon to expose the absolute truth about her to the entire city." The news director, sensing a massive ratings boost from a wealthy family scandal, agreed immediately. Thomas hung up the phone, a cold and desperate smile spreading across his face. He actually believed he could spin this disaster into a story of parental victimhood. I believed he could use the media to force me into dropping the evidence and returning the girls. He had absolutely no idea that his desperate press conference was now playing exactly into the final devastating legal trap I had already set for him. He had absolutely no idea that his desperate press conference was now playing exactly into the final devastating legal trap I had already set for him. I watched the live broadcast, sitting alongside my attorney, Veronica. The news stations positioned their cameras to capture the massive mansion in the background, a deliberate choice by my parents to remind the city of their immense wealth and respectability. Beatrice was dressed in a conservative dark gray suit. She wore absolutely no makeup, ensuring the heavy bags under her eyes were visible to every single viewer. My father stood beside her, his posture rigid, his face an expertly crafted mask of heartbroken paternal concern. Caroline stood slightly behind them, looking down at the ground to hide the fresh scratches on her face from her violent altercation with Jamal. It was a masterclass in manipulation. My father stepped up to the cluster of microphones. He took a deep, shaky breath, pausing just long enough for the cameras to capture his manufactured grief. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice cracking with perfect precision. "My wife and I stand before you today, not as business leaders, but as devastated grandparents and heartbroken parents. We are the victims of a cruel, calculated extortion plot orchestrated by our own daughter, Hannah." I watched as Beatrice leaned her head against his shoulder, letting a single tear fall down her cheek. It was truly sickening. My father continued to weave a completely fabricated narrative. He claimed that I was mentally unstable. He told the reporters that my mild depression from college had spiraled into severe paranoia and extreme financial desperation. He looked directly into the camera and boldly stated that I had brainwashed Riley and Lily, turning two innocent, traumatized orphans against the very people who love them most. "Hannah has manipulated the court system using fabricated text messages," my father declared, his voice rising with indignation. "She is holding our beloved grandchildren hostage and attempting to extort our family business for dollars. We are pleading with the public to see the truth. We want our family back. We just want to save those little girls from a highly toxic and dangerous environment." The reporters immediately began shouting questions, asking for details about the extortion and the alleged text messages. My father refused to answer, simply stating that their legal team was handling the matter and they trusted the justice system to return the children to their rightful loving home. Veronica muted the television, crossing her arms as she looked at me. "They are weaponizing their tears," she observed calmly. "They know the federal investigation is going to freeze their assets and destroy their business. This entire spectacle is designed to discredit you before the indictments drop. They are trying to poison the jury pool and paint themselves as victims of a vindictive daughter." My phone immediately started buzzing. Notifications flooded my screen as acquaintances and strangers began tagging me on social media. The internet loves a scandal, and my parents had just handed them a dramatic wealthy family feud, People were demanding that I respond. They wanted me to defend myself, to post angry rebuttals, and to engage in a messy public war of words. I turned my phone face down on the desk. I am not going to say a single word, I told Veronica. If I retaliate online, I play right into their narrative. I look like the bitter, unstable daughter they claim I am. Silence is the only response they cannot manipulate. Instead of engaging with the media circus, I channeled every ounce of my energy into my work. The following week was the massive launch event for my newest children book. My family had always mocked my career as childish doodling, completely unaware that my previous books had sold millions of copies worldwide. This new book, however, was different. It was deeply personal. I had spent the last several months writing and illustrating a story heavily inspired by Riley and Lily. It was a beautiful tale about a fierce older sister who protected a fragile flower until they both found a safe greenhouse to bloom in. It was a story about surviving storms, discovering resilience, and finding out that true family is built on love, not obligation. I spent the next few days finalizing the details for the launch event. The venue was a beautiful historic library in the center of the city. My publishing team had secured attendance from elite literary critics, major media outlets, and hundreds of devoted fans. The event was poised to elevate my career to an entirely new level. It was the perfect contrast to my parents' crumbling, fraudulent empire. While they were busy screaming lies into news cameras to hide their financial crimes, I was quietly preparing to celebrate a story of hope and healing. Riley and Lily had been heavily involved in the launch preparations. I showed them the final printed copies of the book. Lily traced her small fingers over the illustrations, completely mesmerized by the beautiful artwork. Riley read the dedication page, which simply read, "For the bravest protectors, you never have to fight alone again." When Riley looked up at me, her tough exterior softened entirely. She gave me a rare, genuine smile, and in that single moment, every ounce of stress from the legal battle completely vanished. They were safe, they were loved, and my parents could never take that away. However, my silence was driving my father absolutely insane. He had expected me to fight back. He had counted on me issuing an angry, unhinged public statement that his lawyers could use to bolster his false narrative. When I completely ignored his press conference, his strategy stalled. The media cycle moves quickly, and without my participation, the news stations began losing interest in his victim routine. Furthermore, the pressure from the federal investigation was rapidly increasing. Thomas knew his corporate accounts were frozen, and he knew it was only a matter of days before the authorities made their move. He needed to force a public confrontation to regain leverage. 2 days before the book launch, Veronica called me with urgent news. She had received a tip from a contact at a local news station. My father had reached out to several reporters, alerting them that he and Beatrice would be attending a highly publicized event this weekend to directly confront the person extorting their family. "They are planning to crash your book launch," Veronica warned, her voice tight with concern. "They know the venue will be filled with elite publishers and national media. Thomas wants to corner you in front of cameras. He wants to create a massive scene, force you to lose your temper, and capture it all on video to prove you are mentally unstable. We can hire private security to block them at the doors." I walked over to the window of my home office, looking out at the quiet street. My parents had spent my entire life trying to humiliate me and control my behavior. They had used their wealth and status to make me feel small. Now, desperate and backed into a corner, they thought they could use my own professional milestone to force me into submission. They believed I would be terrified of a public scandal at my book launch. They believed I would back down to save my career. "Do not hire extra security," I told Veronica, a cold and decisive calm settling over my mind. "Let them come." Veronica paused on the other end of the line. "Hannah, they are going to turn your celebration into an absolute circus. They will scream, they will cry, and they will ruin the event. You have worked too hard for this." "I know exactly what they are going to do," I replied, my voice steady. "But Thomas does not realize that his timeline perfectly aligns with ours. You told me the federal prosecutors finished reviewing the tax evasion ledgers Jamal handed over, correct?" "Yes," Veronica said slowly. "The indictment is fully drafted. They are just waiting for a judge to sign the final arrest warrants. Then we make sure the judge signs them by Friday morning," I instructed. Let Thomas and Beatrice walk right through the front doors of the library. Let them bring their hired paparazzi and their fake tears. They want a public spectacle, Veronica. I am going to give them the greatest public spectacle this city has ever seen. My toxic family had always vastly underestimated my intelligence, my resilience, and my fierce capacity to successfully protect what was truly mine. They had pushed me, explicitly threatened my daughters, and repeatedly tried to destroy my very sanity. They thought crashing my event would force me to surrender my two girls. They had absolutely no idea they were walking straight into a trap that would permanently end their freedom. The morning of the book launch arrived with a crisp and clear sky. The historic downtown library, a magnificent building made of white marble and towering glass windows, served as the perfect venue for the event. Inside, the massive main hall had been transformed into an elegant celebration of literature and art. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of velvet chairs arranged neatly in rows. The scent of old paper mixed with the fresh, fragrant floral arrangements decorating the stage. My publishing team had spared absolutely no expense. They knew this book was going to be a massive success, and the guest list reflected that anticipation. Elite literary critics, representatives from national media outlets, and hundreds of devoted readers filled the room, their excited chatter echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I stood backstage behind a heavy velvet curtain, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I wore a tailored emerald green suit that made me feel like armor. I peeked through a small gap in the fabric and looked at the front row. Riley and Lily were sitting there dressed in beautiful matching floral dresses. They were accompanied by the retired teacher who had helped me protect them on the day of the raid. Lily was swinging her legs, clutching a brand new hardcover copy of my book to her chest. Riley sat up perfectly straight, her eyes scanning the crowd with that fierce protective instinct she never fully turned off. Seeing them sitting there safe and loved reinforced every single decision I had made over the past few weeks. I was not just an author launching a story today. I was a mother defending her territory. A hush fell over the crowded hall as my publisher stepped up to the wooden podium on the stage. He spoke passionately about my career, praising my ability to weave complex emotional themes into accessible stories for children. He introduced my new book as a masterpiece of resilience and hope. The crowd erupted into a deafening round of applause as he announced my name. I stepped out from behind the velvet curtain and walked into the bright stage lights. The applause washed over me, a physical validation of the life I had built entirely on my own. I approached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. Thank you all so much for being here. I began, my voice echoing clearly through the massive hall. This book is the most personal project I have ever created. It is the story of two brave sisters who weathered terrible storms and found a safe place to finally bloom. It is a story that proves family is not defined by blood or by wealth. Family is defined by those who choose to stand by your side when the world turns dark. I paused, making direct eye contact with Riley in the front row. She offered me a small, proud smile. I opened my mouth to continue my speech, ready to read the first chapter to the audience. Suddenly, a loud, violent crash echoed from the back of the hall. The heavy mahogany double doors burst open with such force that they slammed against the marble walls. The sudden noise caused several people in the back rows to jump out of their seats. A blinding flurry of camera flashes immediately illuminated the dark entryway. My father, Thomas, marched aggressively down the center aisle of the library. Beatrice followed closely at his side, clutching a lace handkerchief to her chest. Caroline trailed right behind them, her face arranged into a mask of absolute manufactured tragedy. They had not come alone. A swarm of hired paparazzi and tabloid reporters flooded into the room behind them, shoving past the library staff and snapping rapid-fire photographs of the chaos. My publisher's security team rushed forward, but Thomas loudly ordered them to step back, using his booming executive voice to command the room. The audience gasped, turning around in their seats as the spectacle unfolded. This was the exact ambush Veronica had warned me about. They had orchestrated a highly publicized invasion of my greatest professional milestone, intending to publicly shame me into submission. They brought reporters to document my downfall. Hannah, my father, roared, his voice carrying over the confused murmurs of the crowd. He stopped at the edge of the stage, pointing an accusatory finger directly at my face. "You are going to stop this insane extortion plot right now. Give us back our family. Give us back the children you stole from us." The hired cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing his aggressive posture and my calm position at the podium. Beatrice let out a loud theatrical sob that echoed terribly through the microphone feedback. She grabbed the edge of the stage, looking up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "How could you do this to us?" she cried out, ensuring every reporter caught her words. "We gave you everything. We loved those little girls, and you kidnapped them. You manipulated the court system to steal our grandchildren just to punish us. Please, Hannah, just bring them home to us." The audience was completely stunned. Literary critics and fans stared in absolute shock as my parents weaponized their white tears and played the ultimate victims. They were spinning a masterful web of deceit right in front of the national media. They wanted everyone in that room to believe I was a bitter, unstable woman who was using two innocent orphans as pawns in a greedy financial dispute. They wanted to destroy my professional reputation entirely. Caroline stepped forward, pushing past a photographer to glare up at me. She pointed sharply at Riley and Lily sitting in the front row. "You are a toxic, delusional liar," Caroline screamed, her voice shrill and unhinged. "You fabricated those text messages to frame my husband. You are trying to destroy Jamal's career and bankrupt our father just because you have always been jealous of us. Drop the fake charges right now, Hannah. Drop the charges, or we will sue you for every single penny you have ever made." The hired paparazzi shouted questions at me, demanding a response to the allegations of kidnapping and extortion. The noise in the library was deafening. Flashbulbs blinded my vision. The security guards were struggling to hold back the aggressive reporters who were trying to rush the stage. Thomas stood tall and confident amid the chaos, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with a cold, triumphant smirk. He honestly believed he had won. He believed the sheer weight of public humiliation would cause me to break down in tears, flee the stage, and surrender to his demands. He expected me to crumble under the intense pressure of the flashing cameras and the judgmental stares of my professional peers. He thought I was weak. I did not crumble. I did not cry. I did not even flinch. I stood perfectly still behind the wooden podium. I looked down at my father, my mother, and my sister. I saw the desperate greed hiding right beneath their fake tears. I saw the absolute panic fueling their aggressive posturing. They were not powerful anymore. They were cornered animals putting on a pathetic final performance before the trap completely snapped shut. They had severely underestimated the lengths I would go to protect my children. The heavy silence of my refusal to react began to unsettle them. Thomas's smirk faltered slightly as he realized I was not experiencing the emotional breakdown he had meticulously planned for. Caroline shifted her weight nervously, her eyes darting between me and the silent audience. The reporters stopped shouting questions, confused by my total lack of panic. The chaotic energy in the room slowly shifted into a tense, suffocating anticipation. The crowd waited for my response, bracing for a screaming match. I gripped the edges of the podium and leaned forward slightly. I offered my family a cold, razor-sharp smile that made the blood drain from Caroline's face. They came here seeking a public spectacle to save their fraudulent empire. They had absolutely no idea that I had already coordinated with federal authorities to turn this exact moment into their ultimate demise. I did not need to scream or defend myself against their pathetic lies. I just needed to show the world exactly who they really were. Without saying a word to my father, I slowly raised my right hand into the air. I looked past the flashing cameras and the stunned crowd, locking eyes with the audiovisual technician sitting in the elevated glass booth at the back of the hall. I gave him a sharp, definitive nod. The technician immediately flipped a switch on his heavy control panel. The bright, harsh stage lights instantly dimmed, plunging the room into dramatic shadows, perfectly setting the stage for their final, absolute reckoning. The massive projector screen unrolled from the ceiling with a heavy mechanical hum. My father William crossed his arms, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. He honestly thought I was about to play a sappy book trailer. He thought he had successfully hijacked my presentation to demand custody of my daughters. Beside him, Beatrice dabbed her dry eyes with her lace handkerchief, readying herself to play the tragic grandmother for the flashing cameras. Caroline stood with her hands on her hips, her lips curled into a vicious sneer. They waited for the vibrant colors of my children's book illustrations to fill the room. Instead, the projector beamed a stark, blindingly white image across the 20-foot canvas. There were no colorful drawings. There was no upbeat background music. There was only bold black text stamped with the official, unmistakable seal of the United States Department of Justice. The document was a live, unredacted federal indictment, and right at the top, printed in bold, capitalized letters, were the names of the two men who had tried to destroy my life. William squinted against the harsh glare of the projector. I watched the exact moment his brain processed the legal jargon displayed above his head. The smug, triumphant sneer melted off his face, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping against the polished oak stage. His face turned the color of wet ash. Beatrice lowered her lace handkerchief, her theatrical sobbing coming to a dead halt. She stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Caroline grabbed her father's arm, her eyes darting frantically across the massive blocks of legal text detailing wire fraud, corporate tax evasion, and conspiracy. I adjusted the microphone on the wooden podium, my hands completely steady. I looked out at the bewildered crowd, then looked down at my family, whose entire empire was currently being broadcast to the national media. For those of you who came to see a story about a family today, you are in luck, I announced, my voice ringing with absolute chilling clarity through the venue's sound system. However, the story playing out behind me is not a work of fiction. It is a certified federal indictment detailing a multi-million-dollar fraud ring operated by the very people standing before you. I pointed directly at my father. The man demanding my daughters, the man claiming I am mentally unstable and unfit to raise a child, is currently facing 20 counts of federal tax evasion and corporate fraud. He has spent the last decade hiding assets in offshore accounts and defrauding the government to fund his lavish lifestyle. William raised his hands, shaking violently. "Turn that off!" he roared, his voice cracking with desperation. "Turn that screen off right now. This is a complete fabrication. She has doctored these documents to ruin me." "I did not doctor anything, William," I replied smoothly, making sure the microphone caught every single syllable. "I did not even have to look for the evidence. Your brilliant, high-powered son-in-law handed it directly to me." Caroline physically recoiled, stepping away from her father and staring up at me in horror. "What are you talking about?" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the room. I leaned into the microphone. "I am talking about Jamal, Caroline. When the State Bar Association threatened to revoke his law license last week, your perfect husband panicked. He begged me to drop the ethics complaint. To save his own skin, he traded the undeniable physical proof of your father's corporate crimes. He handed me the hidden ledgers, the routing numbers, and the shell company documentation. Jamal sold out this entire family just to save his own career." The audience erupted into chaotic whispers and shouted questions. The paparazzi pushed closer to the stage, desperate to capture the total implosion of a wealthy socialite family. William turned slowly toward Caroline, his eyes blazing with a murderous, betrayed fury. "Your husband gave her the ledgers," he hissed, the veins in his neck bulging against his expensive collar. "That arrogant coward gave her everything." Caroline shook her head frantically, tears of genuine panic finally streaming down her face. "No, no, Jamal would never do that," she cried, grabbing her father's sleeve. "He promised me he had a plan to fix the trust fund issue. He promised we were safe." "Well, he lied to you, Caroline," I stated coldly. "Just like he lied to the family court judge." I forwarded the documents Jamal gave me straight to the federal prosecutor's office. "They have spent the last 48 hours auditing your father's manufacturing business. And according to the indictment displayed behind me, they found that you are listed as a silent partner on 3 of those fraudulent shell companies." Beatrice let out a high-pitched wail and collapsed onto the steps of the stage, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. She buried her face in her hands, realizing that her country club status, her mansion, and her entire identity were completely gone. William lunged toward the podium, his hands reaching out as if he could physically strangle the words out of my throat. "You ungrateful, malicious failure," he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "I will destroy you for this." I will hire a team of lawyers to tie you up in litigation for the rest of your miserable life. You are not going to be hiring anyone, William, I said, my voice cutting through his rage like a steel blade. Your corporate accounts were frozen this morning. Your banks have locked you out. You do not have a single penny left to your name. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The powerful, commanding patriarch who had spent 32 years making me feel completely worthless was suddenly nothing more than a broke, desperate criminal standing on a stage he did not own. He looked out at the flashing cameras, raising his hands to block the blinding light. The media he had specifically invited to document my humiliation was now broadcasting his spectacular downfall to the entire country. I looked at the front row. Riley was standing up, holding Lily's hand tightly. Riley was not looking at the screen or the chaotic crowd. She was looking right at me. She gave me a firm, understanding nod. She knew exactly what I was doing. I was burning the monsters to the ground so they could never come for us again. "Hannah, please!" Caroline begged, abandoning her anger and dropping to her knees at the edge of the stage. "Please, you have to tell them it is a mistake. I did not know what Jamal was doing with those companies. I cannot go to prison. I cannot lose my house. We are your family." I looked down at my weeping sister. "You stopped being my family the moment you plotted to steal a 7-year-old child's inheritance to buy a yacht," I said quietly, ensuring only she could hear the absolute finality in my voice. "You made your choices, Caroline. Now you get to live with the consequences." The flashing cameras illuminated the tears streaming down Caroline's face. Beatrice remained huddled on the floor, rocking back and forth, as the reality of their public destruction fully settled in. The journalists were frantically typing on their phones, sending out breaking news alerts about the implosion of a prominent manufacturing tycoon. William stood paralyzed. He was trapped in a room filled with hundreds of witnesses staring at a giant screen that displayed his federal indictment. He looked toward the double doors at the back of the library, calculating if he had enough time to run. He took one step backward toward the exit. Through the thick glass windows of the historic library, an intense burst of flashing red and blue lights suddenly reflected across the walls. The piercing, unmistakable wail of police sirens blared outside the venue. The sirens grew louder and louder, signaling the arrival of multiple law enforcement vehicles pulling up to the main entrance. Heavy synchronized boots echoed loudly in the marble lobby. The heavy wooden double doors at the back of the hall swung open again. This time it was not hired paparazzi or tabloid reporters pushing their way inside. It was a highly organized team of federal agents wearing dark tactical gear and windbreakers boldly emblazoned with the letters FBI across the back. The agents pushed through the crowd of stunned book fans and literary critics, their expressions grim and strictly professional. They did not pause to answer questions from the shouting reporters. They marched straight down the center, their heavy boots thudding rhythmically against the floor, walking directly toward the stage where William and his fractured family stood frozen in absolute terror. The final reckoning had officially arrived. The final reckoning had officially arrived. He did not care about the flashing cameras or the murmuring literary critics inside the hall. He held a thick brown folder in his left hand and a pair of heavy steel handcuffs in his right. Two other agents immediately flanked William. My father tried to step backward, but his back hit the wooden podium hard. "William Anderson," the lead agent announced loudly. His voice carried across the massive library hall without needing a microphone. "You are under federal arrest for corporate tax evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." William opened his mouth to shout an angry order, but an agent swiftly grabbed his wrists and pulled them firmly behind his back. The sharp click of the metal handcuffs locking into place echoed perfectly over the sound system. William struggled against the physical restraint, his face turning a bright shade of crimson red. He demanded his highly paid lawyers. He shouted that he was a powerful manufacturing executive and that they were making a catastrophic mistake. He yelled that he knew the mayor and could have their badges revoked by tomorrow morning. The agents completely ignored his arrogant demands and read him the rest of his rights. He was no longer a wealthy corporate titan. He was simply a criminal facing a long prison sentence. The cameras captured every single moment of his humiliating downfall. Jamal had been standing near the edge of the stage. He watched his father-in-law get handcuffed, and his survival instincts quickly kicked in. He turned toward the side exit, hoping to slip away into the chaotic crowd before anyone noticed him. A massive federal agent blocked his path, placing a firm hand right on his expensive suit jacket. Jamal immediately raised his hands in the air, shifting into his slick lawyer persona. He puffed out his chest, trying to project legal authority to intimidate the officer. "I am a licensed corporate attorney," Jamal stated, his voice trembling slightly, despite his effort to sound commanding. "You have no legal grounds to detain me without a specific warrant. I invoke my right to legal counsel, and I demand to see your probable cause documentation right now." The lead agent turned away from William and walked over to Jamal. He opened the thick folder he was carrying. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and shoved it directly into Jamal's face. "We have a federal warrant signed by a judge at 8 o'clock this morning," the agent replied coldly. "And as for our probable cause, we have the exact offshore account ledgers and shell company routing numbers that you personally handed over to a key witness 2 days ago. You provided the exact roadmap to your own criminal enterprise. We already froze your bank accounts and seized your business assets. You have absolutely nothing left to hide behind. Turn around and put your hands behind your back right now." The crowd watched in absolute silence as the lawyer fell apart. Jamal physically deflated. His broad shoulders slumped forward, and all the fake legal confidence drained from his entire body. He knew he had just been beaten with his own evidence. He slowly turned around and let the agent snap the cold steel cuffs around his wrists. The paparazzi went absolutely wild. The reporters shouted questions at the two disgraced men, asking how long they had been hiding millions of dollars from the government. Flashbulbs illuminated the pure terror on Jamal's sweating face. He looked out at the audience, realizing his pristine public reputation was destroyed forever. His law firm would disbar him by the end of the week. He would never step foot inside a corporate boardroom again. He was going to spend the best years of his life locked inside a federal prison cell. Beatrice could not process the reality of the situation. She had spent her entire adult life believing that her immense wealth and social status made her completely untouchable. She believed she could treat people like disposable garbage and never face a single consequence for her cruelty. Seeing her husband and her favored son-in-law shackled like common criminals broke her fragile superficial reality into tiny pieces. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that forced several people in the front row to physically cover their ears. She dropped to her knees on the stage, her expensive gray designer skirt pooling around her. She pounded her fists against the hardwood floor, wailing incoherently about her country club friends and her ruined reputation. She could not handle the public embarrassment of being exposed as a fraud. She did not cry for her husband facing federal prison. She cried because she knew her luxury estate would be seized and her elite friends would instantly reject her. She was throwing a massive toddler tantrum in front of national media outlets. The cameras captured every single pathetic second of her absolute breakdown. She screamed at the reporters to stop taking pictures, but they only moved closer to document her collapse. Her makeup ran down her face in dark streaks, making her look entirely unhinged. This was the same woman who had coldly told me to send my traumatized teenage daughter back to the foster system. Seeing her brought to her knees by her own greed was the ultimate form of poetic justice. She had built her entire life on a foundation of lies. Caroline stood frozen near the projector screen, watching her perfect life rapidly disintegrate. She realized in a matter of minutes that she was losing everything she had ever cared about. Her wealthy husband was going to federal prison and would likely be disbarred. Her father was bankrupt and arrested. The stolen trust fund money she desperately wanted to use for a Miami yacht was heavily protected by the state. She was about to be entirely penniless, homeless, and publicly disgraced. She looked around the room wildly, her eyes darting from the federal agents to the laughing reporters. She knew her elite social circle was watching this live broadcast. She knew her friends would mock her behind her back. She felt the heavy, crushing weight of absolute failure pressing down on her shoulders. Then her gaze landed on me. I was still standing calmly behind the wooden podium, watching the authorities dismantle their toxic empire. Caroline realized I was the only person left in the room who had any real power. I was a successful author with millions of dollars in book royalties and absolute control over the situation. She desperately thought she could still manipulate my family loyalty to save herself. Caroline ran across the stage, her high heels stumbling over the microphone cords. She stopped right in front of my podium, her face streaked with heavy black mascara and genuine panic. She grabbed the edge of the wooden stand, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "Hannah, please," Caroline begged, her voice cracking as a camera flashed directly in her face. "You have to make them stop. You have to tell them it is a huge misunderstanding. Tell the agents you made a mistake with the documents. We can fix this together. We are your family. I am your little sister. Please do not let them take everything away from us. We have nothing left." I looked down at the woman who had happily plotted to steal my daughters. I looked at the sister who had mocked my career, belittled my home, and actively tried to use the child welfare system to rip my family apart. She expected me to feel pity. She expected the quiet, accommodating sister she used to bully to suddenly step in and save her from her own miserable actions. She thought I would sacrifice my own peace to rescue her from the consequences of her terrible choices. I slowly leaned forward, resting my hands on the solid wood of the podium. I kept my face perfectly smooth and completely unbothered. I made sure the microphone picked up every single word I was about to say, broadcasting my response to the packed library hall and the cameras recording the event. I looked Caroline dead in the eyes, allowing a cold, razor-sharp smile to spread across my lips. I remembered the exact words my mother had carelessly thrown at my daughters during that toxic dinner a month ago. I decided it was the perfect time to return the sentiment. "Keep the sweet one," I said softly, looking over at Lily sitting happily in the front row. Then I looked back down at my sobbing, ruined sister. "Send the damaged ones back. Have a very fun time in federal prison." The sharp feedback from the microphone echoed across the silent library hall as my final words hung in the air. Caroline stared up at me, unable to process the absolute finality of my statement. I simply turned away, walking down the steps of the stage to join Riley and Lily in the front row. Behind me, the federal agents forcefully escorted William and Jamal out through the heavy double doors. The blinding flashes of camera bulbs followed them to the waiting armored transport vehicles parked on the street. The once untouchable patriarch of our family and his arrogant son-in-law were shoved into the back of federal cruisers, their faces pressed against the cold glass as the sirens wailed into the distance. The aftermath of that highly publicized arrest moved through the legal system with a speed that left my family breathless. The federal prosecutors possessed an airtight case, largely thanks to the meticulous financial ledgers Jamal had eagerly handed over to me. However, Jamal quickly learned that his attempt to save his own skin came with a catastrophic price tag. Within 48 hours of his arrest, the State Bar Association permanently revoked his legal license. The elite corporate law firm he had dedicated his life to immediately erased his name from their letterhead, wiped his profile from their website, and issued a public statement condemning his actions. Stripped of his prestige, his wealth, and his professional identity, Jamal found himself sitting in a sterile interrogation room, facing decades behind bars. True to his cowardly nature, Jamal did not hesitate to orchestrate one final, desperate betrayal. He officially turned state's evidence against his father-in-law. He signed a comprehensive plea agreement offering the federal prosecutors an unredacted roadmap of Williams' criminal enterprise, in exchange for a significantly reduced prison sentence. He sat on the witness stand during the preliminary hearings, wearing a cheap orange jumpsuit, and systematically dismantled the manufacturing empire that William had spent 30 years building. Jamal detailed every offshore account, every hidden asset, and every fraudulent tax return with clinical precision. William sat at the defense table, his face a twisted mask of uncontrollable rage. He was forced to listen as the young African-American lawyer he had brought into his inner circle laid out every one of his dirty secrets for the federal judge to hear. William tried to maintain his authoritative posture, glaring at his former son-in-law with pure hatred, but the sheer volume of evidence was absolutely insurmountable. The judge did not show an ounce of leniency. William was sentenced to a lengthy term in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The gavel strike that sealed his fate also authorized the immediate liquidation of his entire manufacturing business. The Internal Revenue Service swooped in, like vultures, seizing factory equipment, freezing corporate payroll accounts, and auctioning off commercial real estate to recoup the millions stolen in tax revenue. William's legacy was completely erased from the corporate world in a matter of weeks. While the men of the family were locked away in federal holding cells, absolute poverty crashed down on Beatrice and Caroline. They had spent their entire lives treating people like disposable garbage, relying on their immense wealth to shield them from any consequences. Now that shield was completely gone. The federal government seized their bank accounts, their luxury vehicles, and their investment portfolios. Beatrice frantically called her wealthy country club friends, begging for temporary loans and places to stay. Every single one of those elite socialites immediately sent her calls straight to voicemail. The same women who used to gossip about my modest lifestyle now pretended they had never even met her. The toxic high society circle they had sacrificed my mental health to impress abandoned them without a second thought. The final devastating blow came when the bank officially foreclosed on their sprawling suburban estate. Federal marshals arrived at the massive iron gates with an eviction notice giving Beatrice and Caroline exactly 2 hours to pack whatever personal belongings they could fit into a few cardboard boxes. The women who used to demand that I send my traumatized teenage daughter back to a foster home were now being forcibly removed from their own property. They dragged their cheap suitcases down the long manicured driveway, completely humiliated as their former neighbors watched the spectacle from behind drawn curtains. With no money, no credit, and zero marketable skills, Beatrice and Caroline were forced to move into a cramped, dilapidated apartment on the outskirts of the city. The contrast to their former life was staggering. The tiny two-bedroom unit smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke and mildew. The linoleum floors were peeling at the corners, and the walls were paper-thin. They had no central air conditioning, no private chef, and no housekeepers to clean up their messes. For the first time in their privileged lives, they had to face the brutal reality of basic survival. The stress of their sudden poverty instantly turned them against each other. Their relationship, which had always been built on a foundation of mutual superiority, dissolved into constant vicious screaming matches. The thin walls of their cheap apartment provided absolutely no soundproofing. Neighbors frequently banged on the walls, demanding they quiet down, as Beatrice and Caroline hurled venomous insults at one another late into the night. Beatrice blamed her daughter for marrying a traitorous coward who handed their financial ledgers to the federal government. She screamed that Caroline had ruined their lives by bringing Jamal into the family. Caroline aggressively fired back, blaming her mother for instigating the entire disaster. She shrieked that if Beatrice had not been so greedy about the hidden trust fund, if she had not constantly pushed to steal Lily away from me, none of this would have ever happened. Caroline cried that her mother's obsession with appearances and wealth had destroyed her marriage and her future. They spent every single day trapped in that roach-infested apartment, suffocating in their own bitterness, completely unable to accept responsibility for their own malicious actions. They were living in a hell of their own creation, isolated from the world, and entirely consumed by their mutual hatred. I received regular updates about their miserable living situation through Veronica, who monitored the ongoing legal fallout to ensure my daughters and I remained fully protected. Hearing about their cramped apartment and their daily screaming matches brought me no joy, but it brought me an overwhelming sense of profound safety. They were too busy tearing each other apart in poverty to ever pose a threat to Riley and Lily again. The dark cloud that had hovered over my entire existence was permanently lifted. I focused my energy on providing a stable, loving environment for my girls. The success of my new book skyrocketed beyond anyone's expectations. Media attention from the launch event, combined with the heartwarming message of the story, propelled the book to the very top of the national bestseller lists. My royalties poured into my accounts, securing a financial future for my daughters that no one could ever touch. Riley flourished in her new school, joining the debate team and channeling her protective instincts into fighting for causes she believed in. Lily grew happier and more vibrant every single day, filling our modest home with genuine laughter. We were thriving, completely detached from the toxic wreckage of my biological family. But there was still one final piece of business to address. The suburban estate my parents had loved more than their own daughter sat completely empty. The massive mansion, with its grand marble staircase, opulent dining room, and pristine manicured lawns, represented decades of superficiality and emotional abuse. It was a monument to their greed, the very place where Beatrice had casually told me to throw Riley away like garbage. The federal government, eager to recoup the millions of dollars stolen through Williams' tax evasion, moved quickly to liquidate the property. The bank officially listed the sprawling estate for public auction. Real estate developers and wealthy investors began circling the property, eager to purchase the luxurious mansion at a steep discount. The auction drew significant attention due to the high-profile scandal associated with the former owners. On the first morning of the auction, the bidding floor was packed with aggressive investors holding numbered paddles ready to fight over the prime real estate. The auctioneer stepped up to the podium, preparing to start the bidding war for the massive property. Before a single paddle could be raised, a representative from an undisclosed holding company stepped forward. He bypassed the entire bidding process. He handed the stunned bank officials a certified document executing a direct, non-negotiable purchase. He paid the full asking price, plus an additional premium, to close the sale immediately. The transaction was completed entirely in cash, shutting out every other investor in the room. The beloved estate had just been legally acquired by a mysterious buyer operating entirely in the shadows. The beloved estate had just been legally acquired by a mysterious buyer operating entirely in the shadows. They were desperate to know who had purchased the physical manifestation of their former glory. They clung to a pathetic, lingering hope that perhaps a wealthy former friend or a sympathetic business associate had bought the property and might take pity on them, maybe offering them a small guest house to live in rent-free. The reality they eventually received was a fatal blow to their already shattered egos. A thick, certified envelope arrived in their rusted, battered mailbox 3 days after the public auction concluded. Beatrice tore it open with violently shaking hands, her breath catching in her throat. Inside was a formal notice of new ownership and an immediate eviction mandate for any remaining property left on the grounds. Beatrice dropped the crisp legal document onto the stained linoleum floor. Her face went entirely pale, devoid of all color. Caroline scrambled to pick it up, her eyes scanning the official bank seal at the very top of the page. The registered owner of the sprawling multi-million-dollar estate was not a faceless corporate entity or a sympathetic country club ally. The sole owner listed on the deed was me. I used a fraction of my accumulated book royalties to purchase the mansion entirely in cash. I did not buy it for revenge, though the poetic justice of legally owning the exact property where they had constantly made me feel worthless was undeniably satisfying. I bought it because I knew exactly what that massive empty space needed to become. Caroline screamed when she read my name. She threw the heavy document across the tiny kitchen, finally realizing that the sister she had relentlessly mocked as a doodler now owned the very empire she had lost. That piece of paper severed their last remaining thread of delusion. They were completely defeated, trapped in their own miserable reality, while the daughter they discarded held the keys to their former kingdom. I drove up the long, winding driveway of the estate exactly 1 week later. The heavy iron gates swung open automatically, recognizing my vehicle. I parked in the massive circular driveway and stepped out, looking up at the towering marble columns. For 32 years, this house had represented cold expectations, conditional love, and intense emotional abuse. It was a fortress of superficiality, where my mother had casually pointed at my traumatized teenage daughter and told me to send her back. Now the heavy, toxic energy of the property was completely gone. I unlocked the massive front doors and walked into the grand foyer. The space was entirely empty. The expensive Persian rugs, the crystal vases, and the pretentious antique furniture had all been liquidated by the federal government to pay off my father's massive debts. The house was a blank canvas ready to be completely rewritten. I did not move into the mansion. I had absolutely no desire to live within those walls. My modest house filled with the smell of home-cooked meals and the sound of my daughters laughing was already a perfect palace. Instead, I hired a team of elite contractors to completely gut the interior of the estate. We tore down the dark, oppressive walls that separated the rooms. We ripped out the cold marble flooring and replaced it with warm, inviting hardwood. We transformed the grand dining room where Jamal had mocked my career into a massive sunlit art studio filled with wooden easels, vibrant paints, and messy clay stations. I converted the sprawling estate into a fully funded art therapy and sanctuary center for orphaned and traumatized children. I partnered with local child welfare agencies and dedicated social workers to provide a safe, beautiful environment where kids navigating the broken foster care system could come to heal. The pristine, manicured lawns where my parents used to host exclusive garden parties were replaced with therapeutic community gardens, colorful playgrounds, and completely safe outdoor spaces. The lavish guest suites that Caroline and Jamal had aggressively fought over were transformed into emergency transition housing for vulnerable youth who needed a temporary place to call home. The center opened its doors 6 months later. I named it the Safe Harbor Art Academy, standing in the main hallway on opening day, watching children who had experienced unimaginable loss eagerly pick up paintbrushes and discover their own voices, brought overwhelming tears to my eyes. I had taken a monument to intense greed and transformed it into a fortress of absolute healing. My parents had deliberately used their wealth to isolate, manipulate, and intimidate people. I chose to use my wealth to pull broken pieces back together. The generational cycle of toxic abuse was permanently broken. I handed the keys to a highly qualified board of directors to run the facility, ensuring the center would outlast us all. I did not need my name plastered on the building to know what I had accomplished. The bright smiles on the faces of those resilient children were the only validation I would ever need. That evening, I drove back to my actual home. The sun was setting gently, casting a warm golden glow over our quiet, tree-lined street. I unlocked my front door and was instantly greeted by the comforting smell of baking chocolate chip cookies. I walked into the kitchen and smiled warmly. Riley and Lily were standing by the counter, completely covered in white flour and laughing uncontrollably. The terrified, fiercely guarded girls I had brought home all those months ago were completely gone. Lily was absolutely thriving. Her natural joy had fully returned, and she no longer clutched her stuffed bear with desperate fear. She was doing beautifully in school and had made a wonderful group of supportive friends. But the most profound transformation was Riley. The teenager my family had cruelly called damaged and broken had blossomed into a confident, brilliant, and fiercely protective young woman. She no longer stood in the shadows waiting for someone to reject her. She stood tall, knowing with absolute certainty that she was permanently safe. She had joined her middle school debate team, channeling her sharp mind and protective instincts into advocating for others. She was an exceptional older sister, guiding Lily with a gentle patience that constantly amazed me every single day. "Mom, look what we made." Lily cheered happily, running over to hug my waist. Riley walked over, wiping a smudge of flour from her cheek. She held out a piece of thick watercolor paper. "I made this for you in art class today," Riley said, her voice soft but steady. I took the paper from her hands. It was a beautiful, deeply detailed drawing of the three of us standing under a massive oak tree. We were holding hands and the strong roots of the tree wrapped protectively around us. At the bottom of the page, written in Riley's careful handwriting, were the words, "Our roots are made of love, not blood." I pulled both of my daughters into my arms, holding them tightly against my chest. The feeling of absolute peace washed over me, replacing every single ounce of stress from the past year. We had survived the ultimate storm. We had faced down monsters wearing expensive suits and defeated them using nothing but truth and unwavering loyalty. Later that night, after the girls were asleep, I sat in my quiet living room with a hot cup of tea. I looked at the framed drawing Riley had made, now sitting proudly on our mantelpiece. My journey had taught me the most valuable lesson a person can ever learn. Society tells us that family is determined by genetics, that bloodlines demand automatic respect and endless forgiveness. But biology is nothing more than a random roll of the dice. True family is not determined by blood or elite social status. Family is built by those who choose to stay when things get incredibly hard. It is forged in the fires of shared struggles and cemented by unconditional support. My biological parents had treated me like a disappointing financial liability. My sister had viewed me as a pathetic competitor. They had built an empire of glass that shattered the moment the truth was exposed. But the family I chose, the two brave girls who trusted me to protect them, was built on a foundation of solid granite. I had walked through absolute hell to keep them safe, and I would do it 1,000,000 times over without a single second of hesitation. If you are watching this and you have ever felt like you do not belong in your own family, please know that you are not alone. You do not have to accept emotional abuse simply because you share a last name with your abusers. You have the power to walk away, to redefine your own worth, and to build a beautiful life entirely on your own terms. Your value is not dictated by the people who failed to appreciate you. The family you create for yourself will always be stronger than the one that tried to break you. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about resilience and overcoming toxic families. Let me know in the comments how you built your own chosen family. Remember, your peace is always worth protecting.